Hey, everyone. Thanks for being here. I will talk a little bit about the platform that we've been running for the past years, but also talk a little bit about what we learned from the data that we collected from that and what that tells us about how voters behave with respect to different voting methods. So participatory budgeting, I'm assuming a lot of you are familiar with it, is this method where people are asked to allocate a fixed budget among a number of different projects. There's a large scale of participative processes, and in a lot of budget cases, at least in the United States, that's even some kind of a requirement. But in a lot of cases, that will actually be more on the informative side of the scale. So, for example, a town hall meeting where citizens are mainly informed about what the budget is going to be, and they get like a minute to say whatever they think about it, but it's not actually taken into consideration. Participatory budgeting is on the far other side of that spectrum, where people actually get to design projects, improve them, and then actually vote on them, like which projects get implemented. Today, I'll give a little bit more background about our participatory budgeting, about our platform. I'll talk a little bit about the data that we made available. And then I'll talk more about how we can infer knapsack votes from ranked ballots, or how we do that and what we learned from that. I'll talk about the knapsack effect, which is the effect on the average cost of selected projects when people use different voting methods. I'll talk a little bit about ballot complexity, and then I'll look a little bit more ahead. So participatory budgeting is this empowering mechanism, and it has some real benefits that we've seen in the literature. For example, it seems to encourage people to actually participate in other voting processes and other parts of democracy as well. People are, so as I mentioned, they're asked to allocate their budget across different items, projects, with stakeholder participation. This can take all kinds of different forms, but these processes, they usually have some kind of idea collection phase. They have some kind of project shaping where people improve the project so that the best version of the project is on the ballot. Then they have some kind of voting phase where the actual decision is made, and there's some kind of implementation. Just to give you an image of this is a much broader process than just voting. I'll mostly be talking about voting. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that a lot of the innovation is also happening on the rest of that pipeline. That voting by itself then consists actually, if we disentangle that, from two different components. One is elicitation, where we ask people for their opinion, and the other is aggregation. What do we do with that information? The Stanford PB platform predates my own time, so this is a lot of work that is based, by the way, on a paper that I wrote with Gelauff, who's also here. And the platform was created in his group. I think in 2012 it started.
2014.
2014 was the first election that was supported by it, for sure. And it's currently being used in a number of different cities across the United States, including cities like Seattle, Chicago, Vallejo. And it supports a number of different voting methods and has a flexible visualization to it. It is open source software, so you can download it and run it as on your own server, or you can use it as a service from our platform, from our own server, which makes it much easier for cities to run a voting process and to lower that threshold. On our own server, we supported over the past decade or so. We supported 180 different ballots. So sometimes a city runs multiple ballots because they have many different districts. And they distributed collectively about $130 million, and they collected about 160,000 votes. The settings of that ballot are really determined by the election organizer. Even though we run the server, it is really a self-serve platform where the city designs the actual ballot. They design the setup, they design the look and the feel, or not the look and the feel as much, but really what kind of voting method do you want? What kind of languages can you support in your city? What is needed? What kind of voter validation do you need in your specific situation? In our case, this is mostly North American cities, so that is what it has been tailored for. For example, in the United States, there's not a lot of cities that actually know exactly who lives in their city. So that makes it much harder to use European-style voter authentication in an American context. So most of these cities use SMS authentication to ensure that people don't submit multiple ballots, or at least not a lot of ballots. The city also uploads their own projects, and they basically run it all themselves. I mostly help them in understanding, like, what do the different design choices mean? What do the different options in the software result in? At the end, they can do a demographic survey, which is disconnected. So even though they do collect demographic information, I foresee a lot of questions in that always. Unfortunately, we cannot connect that back to the actual votes. And that is by design, because we want to keep some kind of voter integrity here. And finally, this has been designed as a research platform initially. So that is why there's also an option to run a research ballot after the official ballot. More about that later. The default aggregation that we support is a greedy allegation or border count in case of ranked voting. But other aggregations can be supported through exporting, as has been done, for example, by Stadtidee in Switzerland in 2023. They used K-token voting in combination with the method of equal shares, I believe. So there's a lot possible, of course, once you allow exporting. From the perspective of the voter, this is what a voting process really looks like. They first arrive at a landing page that explains who is asking for their opinion, what they're voting on, where the vote will be implemented, like what will we do with it, and then they have to authenticate. That's usually an SMS authentication. Sometimes the city also asks for some personal details so they can post-authenticate. For example, what is your address? And then afterwards, they will check, like, is that address actually in our zone or not? And then they will just give me a list of numbers that have to be voided because it's disconnected from the actual votes. Then they will see the primary ballot, which is not to be confused with the primary election. It's a primary ballot, which is the main ballot of the election, the official ballot with the official voting method. And then optionally, they can see a secondary ballot with the same projects, the same voter, the same information, everything, just a different voting method, which is our research ballot. And then finally, the city can choose to run a demographic survey, again, which is disconnected, which just runs in an iframe. These are the elicitation methods that we support are K-approval voting, where people are asked to elect up to K projects, K-ranking voting, where people are, again, asked to select up to K projects, but then in a second step, also rank them in order of preference. Knapsack voting, where people are asked to select any number of projects they want, as long as they fit within a fixed budget. Or K-token voting, where people are asked to distribute up to K tokens across the projects that they prefer. And this resulted, after many years of data collection, many collaborations with all the cities, in a data set that has about 124 different elections in it, with 125,000 votes and 1,500 projects. This is all anonymized, so we made sure that we only take elections that are at least 100 voters, make sure that all these elections, that the order is randomized to a certain extent, that we cannot trace it back to an individual voter, basically. And for the vote, we have the voter ID, the project ID, what budget they allocate to each project, and what tokens, for example. The data set is available online in case anyone wants to play with it. And these elections, they have a few different voting methods, as I mentioned. K-token voting is fairly recent, so we don't have any elections in our data set for that yet. Like I mentioned, ARO used it, but they used it on their own server. So we don't have that data in our data set. But it's mostly approval voting, which is in line with what was the most popular voting method in the United States PB elections for many years. But recently, we've seen more and more knapsack votes and more ranking votes come up. So the city decides the voting method. And as I mentioned, there's also sometimes a secondary ballot, which is the +2 + 18, which is the number of secondary ballots that we have available for those methods. As you can see, we have a range of different number of projects available. So every dot represents one election. And we have the number of votes. So the size of the election is also fairly different. And this gives us a few building blocks that we can start playing with in our analysis. So first of all, we have ballot pairs, the primary and the secondary ballot that people can fill out, where the same voter in the same election, we ask people in different voting methods what their opinion is. Secondly, we have a randomized control trial between different voting methods in the secondary ballot. So sometimes we had enough voters, or we were expecting enough voters, that we would randomly assign people to one or the other voting method in the secondary method. So that gives us a randomized control trial at that point. Thirdly, we have long K-ranking votes, which I'm not aware of a lot of long K-ranking votes in participatory budgeting being available, but that allows us to infer a knapsack and approval vote with some natural assumptions. Finally, we also have the abandonment rate for each election. So that tells us like how many people did not complete the ballot on this specific step. And we have the median completion time. Basically how much time did people take to complete it, which allows us to compare different ballot designs. And some of the open questions in the literature that we wanted to take a stab at is, for example, there were some claims that we wanted to test more rigorously than previously was possible. So first of all, there was the claim that knapsack votes could be listed on paper through K-ranking. So basically you take a long ranking and then you do the math for the people. Because knapsack voting is really easy on a computer where you just keep track of how many projects people have selected. And if they are violating their budget constraint, you cannot expect that from people on paper. I mean, I'm sure you guys could, but a lot of voters would get stuck there. So if you want to do that on paper, the workaround that they found was to basically ask people to give a long ranking. And then we do the math for them. So we just go from the top and we just fill their knapsack until they run out of budget. So we wanted to look like, can we actually do that based on our data? Is that a reasonable approach? Secondly, knapsack voting was leading to higher costs of that should be lower cost. I think that's a typo. My bad. So knapsack voting leads to a lower cost of projects being selected. So if people select projects with knapsack voting, the literature said like the average cost of a project was lower on aggregate. We dive more deeply into that with much more data. So that's going to be some interesting results. And then finally, knapsack voting was claimed to be cognitively burdensome on voters. This was supposed to be like a really hard method to use. And Gelauff already suggested that in practice, that may not be so hard. But the question now is like, how do real voters behave on a larger number of elections? So the first thing we wanted to test is like these secondary ballots. That's all nice and fun, but can we actually trust them, right? Like, is this actually a method? Are people filling them out seriously? So what we did is we took people's primary ballots, we took all the secondary ballots in that same election, and we basically calculated a budget overlap between every pair of those ballots. And then we ranked people's utility among all the possible utilities if we would have taken a random secondary ballot and look at like at what percentile do they end up. And we see that the percentile that they end up is actually really high. So that gives us a good indication that given all the possible things that people filled out in the secondary ballot, this is a very similar one to their primary ballot. So this gives us a good indication that these secondary ballots actually contain useful information. We don't expect them to be identical, of course, because these are different voting methods. So there is to be expected some differences, but we see that it has useful data. Secondly, what we did, we used the same kind of approach with looking if we can actually infer knapsack votes from K-ranking. So if we infer a knapsack ballot from a long ranking ballot, how does that compare with their actual knapsack ballot? So if people first vote with knapsack and then they vote with ranking, we can actually look at that inferred pair. We looked first at like two different inferring methods. So we looked at like, we could do some kind of partial allocation and we could do some kind of like skip allocation where you skip the, so if you do the math for the people, once you run out of budget, you have always some budget left. You could then either skip the next budget and just see like, is there another project that still fits in that slot? Or you could try to do some partial allocation. Or you could even just say like, you know what, never mind, this is the end of it. And we find that actually the skip approach where you skip the more expensive projects, gets closest to to people's actual knapsack ballots. Fairly intuitive, perhaps, but that was good to know. And what we also see is that, again, that the percentile and those scores are actually fairly high. So that means that we can actually use we can use these inferred ballots as an approximation. Secondly, we looked at this knapsack effect. So this was this claim that if you ask people to select projects with the knapsack voting method, where you explicitly give them all the budget values for the cost for every project, and you give them a budget to work with, they select cheaper projects than if you ask them to just select their 5 favorite projects. Is that actually the case? You still give them all the budget information, of course. So you still tell them how much budget is available. You still tell them what the cost of each project is. And we see that if you compare K approval with knapsack votes, there's 3 ways we look at this. So first of all, the overall effect. So we look at all the individual ballots, and then we look at like, is the average cost of a project on approval, is that lower or higher than their knapsack projects for that particular voter? Secondly, what we did is we compared the knapsack with the inferred knapsack votes. So if we, that means that we take away the elicitation effect. We only look at the elicitation effect. So we only look at the fact, so we don't care anymore about the implicit constraints, because you could argue like, well, this project combination would never have been possible because you have knapsack voting. At this point, we already come to the point like we restrict ourselves to only combinations that are valid under knapsack voting. And thirdly, we isolate the effect from implicit budget constraints. So in that case, we compare inferred knapsack with inferred K approval. So it's the same ranking vote, but we infer both of the other votes, and we compare those with each other. So then we remove the interface out of the equation. And for that, there's 3 statistics that we're calculating. First is the average cost, where we basically take the average cost on one ballot, the average cost of the other ballot for the same voter, and we take that difference. The second thing that we calculated was the average of the top 3 most expensive projects. So we take the top 3 most expensive projects on one ballot, take the average cost of that, do the same for the other ballot, and take the difference. And finally, the difference between the most expensive project that they selected. Now, the knapsack effect for the overall vote, right? So we compare regular ballot pairs of approval and knapsack. And we have 17 elections available where we have that ballot pair. And in 13 of those elections, we see a significantly positive average cost effect. So where the approval ballot is more expensive, or results in more expensive projects than the knapsack ballot. There was one election where the effect was actually reverse and also significant. So that means that it's not entirely independent of like the ballot design. It might have some relationship with like what projects are on the ballot and things like that. But it's a very, it's across the board, it's a very clear effect and a very clear trend. And the average effect that we've seen is about 4% of the budget is the difference between the average cost of the different ballots. Secondly, what we looked at is these top 3. Like if we take only the most expensive projects that people select, what is the difference? And we see that that effect then washes away. If we look at only the interface, so in this case, we isolate the effect of the interface. We only look at knapsack and inferred knapsack. We see that, again, there is a contribution of an effect. And we see the effect is a bit smaller, of course, because it's only a partial effect. But we see that the explicit budget constraints really contribute to this lower cost. And then finally, if we look at the approval and knapsack aggregation, so if we only look at like, we infer both ballots, we again see an effect. So it's really contributing all of it to that overall knapsack effect. The second thing we wanted to look at is the ballot complexity. So we took all these primary elections and we basically, we just looked at correlations there. And what we see is that there's not really an apparent effect of so while the complexity has a clear effect on the median time that people spend on a ballot, it does not seem to be correlated with higher abandonment rate, which is really encouraging. The complex, but however, it's only correlation. What we do know is that it's a fairly specific situation with a fairly specific voter audience. These are motivated voters, and there's only small increases in complexity. So of course, don't try to go wild and create now super complex ballots and expect that people don't drop out. There will definitely be more validation needed for that kind of assumptions. If we look at the knapsack ballot, as some of you may have noted, is the abandonment rate does significantly correlate with the use of knapsack voting. However, if we look at that randomized trial, then we don't see that effect. So that may have something to do with the fact that certain cities choose to use knapsack voting versus other cities, which may correlate, for example, with cities that are more aggressive with their recruiting, which would drive the abandonment rate up already. So this is really encouraging if we want to do more complex ballot designs. And if we want to consider slightly more complex questions that we want to ask people, more nuanced. But we also see really some interesting results with regards to using paper ballots. So we get a lot of questions from cities that are interested in trying out different voting methods than just approval voting, which is really encouraging. And we see some, for example, people also want to do like category constraints or things like that. I think I'm almost out of time. So I'll skip a few of the other things and mostly thank you for your time.
I should be able to take.
Yeah.
Yeah, great, thanks. Is there any, do you have any data or any thoughts about, like, if you have projects that have one really, really expensive project and a bunch of like small, less expensive projects versus a setting where you have like 5 really expensive projects and a bunch of smaller ones? Is there anything in your data, or do you have any thoughts about then could a certain ballot work better for the first situation as opposed to the next situation, or do you not see a difference between those two types of situations?
Do I have thoughts about that? Yes, for sure. I'm happy to talk about that in the break. But I think that's more speculation based on like what I've seen also in conversations with cities. Because I mean, we have 124 elections, but that is not really enough to draw this kind of detailed questions.
Oh, I see. Because
a lot of the cities use like a fairly similar ballot, like design of their ballots in the sense of like what projects they select.
Yeah.
Due to the nature of participatory budgeting.
Right.
So I think that would require some more user studies or something like that is more that can really zoom into that. But that's an interesting observation.
Thanks.
Do you have a qualitative sense of sort of what type of ballot, sort of what type of projects win via participatory budgeting versus like what the council people would have done without an election?
Not based on this data. So we've tried to get some of that data. Unfortunately, it's really hard to get any information from a council person, like what would you have done if they know that they're going to be overruled. And it's just like that feels like a very vulnerable thing. So I still need to figure out like a good way to get to that kind of data without embarrassing politicians too much. But it's a fascinating question.
I have a question. So you say under knapsack, cheaper projects win, so more projects win. In your conversations with cities, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I think I ran into only one example where a city says like, well, actually, we would like more expensive projects would be interesting. But I think in most cases, they consider it a good thing because if you have more projects that win, it's more likely that everyone will get something they like. And also it's an encouragement for that. So we have to go back to that design phase, right? Like if people propose projects, we have to keep in mind that that's also part of the process. And if people know that cheaper projects are more likely to win, then they're more motivated to keep that in mind while they're designing their projects. So I think from that perspective, it would definitely be a positive aspect.
Just a quick clarification, you talked about inferring knapsack votes from ranking votes. Is that the only type of sort of vote inference that you're doing?
No, we also did the same for approval voting. So you can imagine, so we only did it for votes that we also received from a different method. So we only did it for knapsack and for approval, but you can do the same for approval where we see some differences. So what we notice is that also the average cost goes down a little bit as well when you ask people, if you look at the inferred approval votes versus the approval votes, which is really interesting because as you may or may not recall, those interfaces are nearly identical. So that the only difference is really that we first ask people to make their choice and then rank them. And then their top ranks are actually lower cost than you would expect based on their approval votes. So that means that somehow that ranking phase makes people reconsider what they really think is important or something like that. So there are some interesting effects to be tweezed out there, but I'm sure there's more possible.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.